In our last video, we looked at using the graphing calculator to find out some basic statistics involving snowfall in Chicago. This time I want to talk about quartiles, and we'll start this process the same way we started last time by doing this one var stats thing. So real quick, if you want to see what data I'm working with, let me just switch back to that. So here's the data that we had used in the last video. If that data is still typed in your calculator, great. If not, why don't you pause the video and get that data typed back in. And then if you don't recall how to run this statistics option, maybe again go back and check out that last video. So I'm going to assume you have your data typed in and you've run that calculation right here, and you can see that this thing that we call quartiles can be found down here towards the bottom. They're going to be made up of 5 different things. In fact, we call this the 5-number summary. And so the minimum and max values, as well as the median, the middle of it, and then this thing Q1 and Q3. So I've gone ahead and recorded all that information here so I have it, but let's really talk about what these numbers represent. Basically, these are called quartiles because about 25% of my data, a quarter of my data, is going to occur in each interval. So between the minimum and the first quartile, about 25% of my data lies there. And similarly, between the median, which is sometimes called Q2, the middle quartile, and Q3, about 25% of my data is between there. In the last video, we also mentioned this interquartile range. The interquartile range is the difference between Q3 and Q1. So I've gone ahead and subtracted that again here. That number doesn't appear on the calculator, but it's a simple enough calculation for us to do to subtract that. Because that covers 2 sort of intervals in here, 2 25% intervals, that interquartile range together is going to cover 50% of my data. So some of these things that I can use to then interpret what the 5-number summary means. I could make a lot of different conclusions about this, so answers could vary, but I could say things like, well, I know 50% of the snowfall is probably going to be between 29.53 inches and 53.54 inches because that was the interquartile range. I could also use the median to say about 50% of the time, according to my data, the snowfall will be above 34.7 inches or 37.4 inches, and about 50% of the time it would be less than. I could also use some of the higher quartiles. Q3 would represent, well, let's see, that'd be 25, 50, 75%. I could say that 75% of the time your snowfall is expected to be below the 53.45 inches. Basically, I can use any sort of interpretation I want to use on this data, just remembering that each interval, each little quartile step represents another 25% of the data.